Hello, on behalf of the Goethe-Institut Max Mueller Bhavan Mumbai, I would like to welcome everyone on the second day of our conference, State of Nature Dialogues. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Ruth Padel, who is joining us from London. Ruth Padel is an award-winning British poet and conservationist and author of 12 acclaimed poetry collections, including We Are All From Somewhere Else. A prose and poetry work arguing that migration and poetry are a natural part. Her other work includes Darwin, A Life in Poems, on her great-great-grandfather Charles Darwin. Novels include Where the Serpent Lives on Indian wildlife. Her non-fiction includes an in-depth study on tiger conservation across Asia. She's professor of poetry and at King's College, London, fellow of, I think I lost it down here. Fellow of Royal Society of Literature and Zoological Society of London, a trustee of New Networks for Nature, a UK alliance of scientists, artists, and conservationists. Today, the topic of her talk today is We Are All Connected, the State of Nature and What We Are Doing to Ourselves. I wish everyone a pleasant talk, and Ranjit will be responding post the lecture. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be giving this, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a topic that is really close to my heart, how art and science can meet together with conservationists to get the message of the crisis in nature out there and to offer people thoughts about how they can think and feel about it. And I have to say, really, that my first education in conservation came in India when 24 years ago, when I was starting to research tigers. And I met so many wonderful conservationists. I learned in the field on hand, as it were, not just in India, also Thailand and other Asian countries, but it was particularly and has been ever since Indian scientists, conservationists, forest guards that I've been returning to, and conservationists everywhere in India. Well, Tolstoy said in the late 19th century that one of the first conditions of happiness is that links between man and nature not be broken. And Darwin saw that connectedness as a tangled bank. First of all, he was talking, of course, about nature's connectedness, plants of many kinds, birds on bushes, insects, earth, so different from each other, dependent on each other in so complex a manner. Well, whether we're in Silent Valley, as here in Kerala, or in Down Bank, where Darwin was talking about this tangled bank with little British orchids, there are the same problems, but just on a different scale. And I am talking to you from London, and Britain is one of the most degraded ecosystems in the world. We are tiny, and our green space is tiny. India is huge, and it has a lot of more complex, much more complex problems than we do, but we can't handle our own. I think the forest is the perfect image of connectedness, partly because I learnt conservation through tigers and in forests. But it's so interesting that it's not only the connectedness above the ground, it's also the connectedness below the ground. Here you have the mycorrhizal networks, which are fancifully imaged here as a great handshake under the earth. The way that the fungal roots and systems below the earth act as a kind of vector for the trees to feed, but also to connect with each other. And India knew this a long time ago, knew the connectedness of the forest, that it is this great image of the connectedness of nature, of which we are a part. If you think of so many miniatures, for instance, you have the human figures in a landscape, in a beautiful natural landscape. In the Mahabharata, do that which is for the good of all creatures, as for one's own happiness. Do not cut down the forest with its tigers. There can be no forest without tigers, no tigers without a forest. The forest shelters the tigers, and the tigers guard the forest. And in that tangle of Darwin's, we are a part, as I said. Indigenous cosmologies knew that that connection is sacred, and the place of a sacred forest is also the place of connectedness. For instance, the Dongria Khons in Orissa on the Niamgiri Hills, home of their god, Niam Raja, protected their forested hills from Vedanta's plan to extract millions of tons of aluminium from it. But to talk of the state of nature, we have to look at our own divided nature, I'm afraid. We are conflicted creatures. And alongside the idealization of harmony in nature, the Western model of relations to nature was to use it. And the way we have used it has broken our connection. We have put things into it. Every one of us could have put in into this rubbish heap which those Sri Lankan elephants are eating, and from which they later died of plastic waste. Any of the things any of us threw away, they could have eaten. Any of us could have left something in the ocean, a plastic bag which the turtles tangled in. And of course, there is the red mud. This is 219, the spill of red mud into the Subarnarekha River in Jharkhand from the Hidalgo bauxite plant. Extraordinarily, making each ton of aluminium generates 1 to 1.5 tons of red mud, which is highly corrosive. It damages the soil. It damages, of course, it destroys life forms, and it will never leave the earth. So if you look from above, for instance, Orissa, or there are places in Hungary and Poland also where there are aluminium plants, you see these sort of squares of red poison in the earth. We also take things out. I could have shown you any extractive mine, coal mine, anywhere in the earth, but also this ridiculous UK Environment Agency, which allows masses of tons of sewage into all our rivers every year, this month stripped this beautiful river of its trees. And they said they justified it. They did it suddenly without telling anybody. And they said it was just ill-thought, idiotic, ill-informed. And they said trees at water level pose a flood risk for properties and businesses. Measures are in place to compensate, such as planting with native trees. Well, those are native trees already. It's just a kind of, well, you know the score. And I just wanted to show that because it was something that recently came to us in our small-scale country that we are trying to protect. And so all these taking things in, putting things out of nature, have created what we're now in. Over the last 500 million years, there have been 5 mass extinctions on Earth when the diversity of life suddenly contracted. Now it's happening again, and it's due to us. The destruction of wild habitat for food, poisoning the seas, river, and soil. And the ecologist Paul Ehrlich said, in pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it perches. And you can see here that conservation is this little green umbrella, people working to protect the environment. And there's this little bubble that they're trying to protect of natural systems, which actually are required to support human civilization and life on Earth. The media and the general public put their head in the sand, and the populists say umbrellas are a gross interference in the market economy. And here are all the issues which affect all of us. And above all, there is the spectre of climate change. And the economist William Nordhaus started his Nobel speech on climate crisis with an image of Goya's El Colosso. Goya painted this mysterious painting really out of the sort of image of Napoleon's invasion of Spain. but and the only life form that is maybe not a very good picture of it, but it's there's one small donkey standing still, but everybody else is running away. How do we think about this? It's very hard not to think in terms of retribution. And I was started as a classicist in ancient Greece, so I go to ancient Greece, and I think it's a useful culture to think with, not because it began Western civilization, but I think it's useful to think with in India because it was supported, all those thinkers and dramatists and poets and philosophers, they were resting on a system of multiple gods, very much alive in the environment, incarnate in nature, in animals, and also in human nature. And you never knew when they might strike, like a snake, or maybe a tiger attack in a village. But also you might be engulfed in rage and do something really, really stupid you will regret all your life, or fall in love. You don't normally see them. That's the point, but they're always there, within us and in nature outside us. And you might step on their territory unaware. Last time I was in India, I wish I could be with you today in person, but the last time I was in India was 2 years ago. And I was staying with people who have a tiny patch of forest in Tamil Nadu. But it was dangerous to go out at night, even to walk from one building to the other, because the elephants might be anywhere. It's on a migration route for elephants. And because, I'm sure you all know this, because of the way elephants are sort of harassed out of their shrinking territory and shrinking resources, they are becoming much more suspicious and resentful, and they may charge you, and they often mean to kill. It's becoming a very dangerous situation everywhere. And it is very similar, I think, in a way, to the Greek sense of sacred territory that you might step on unaware and invade, and following that, there will be a retribution. You probably all know the story of Philoctetes, who in an island he didn't know, he stepped unaware into sacred territory of a nymph. And she responded by making a snake bite him, and so he got an unhealable wound. Well, another famous character is Erysichthon, whose name means earth terror. And he cut down his the sacred grove of Demeter, the earth goddess. And then he came to one particular tree, which was venerated and was hung with votive offerings. And his men refused to cut it down. So he grabbed the pitchfork or the axe and did it himself. And he killed the nymph who inhabited that tree. And as a result, Demeter inflicted him with insatiable hunger. And there are sort of rather ghastly sort of 18th century pictures of him. He ended up by selling his daughter and then devouring his own flesh. And this is often used these days as an image of consumption. We are consuming ourselves in consuming nature. This idea of retribution is the same principle for the Furies, who protect family blood. It's an important element, I think, in Hinduism, as I say, it was certainly an important element in ancient Greek religions, that the deity that you turn to for protection in one particular sphere, for instance, not having a traffic accident in Bangalore, is also the deity who might inflict you with a traffic accident. And so the Furies are guardians of family, of kinship. And their rationale, they say, in the famous dramatist Aeschylus, his last play, which is about kinship and society and ends with the establishment of democratic Athens. The Furies appear in that last play, and they say, there is a place where the terrible is good. It must remain in the mind as a watcher, a guard. But then the law case goes against them, and Athena, the goddess of Athene, where it's being tried, says that they are not to pursue the man who has killed his mother anymore. And they are furious. They feel dishonored. as it were, their territory, which is the family bond, is being dishonored and polluted and stained. I am dishonored, heavy angered. I pour venom on this earth, drops spilling out on the land. And I think this principle of the land, protecting the land and the territory in which there is a sacred connection, is really important. And I think we instinctively feel that, our guilt about what we're doing to the planet, eco-guilt, as well as eco-grief and eco-anxiety and all the other new emotions that have been bombarding us in the last sort of 20 years. There's this sense of we have done it. And now we have to turn to bits of hope. When Darwin was refuting the idealized image of nature as a balance and showing that the, quote, harmony of nature was always competition and a struggle, in a way, he was bringing back something that the Greeks knew too. So harmony comes from this word harmonia. It comes from a verb to fit together, harmotane, and fitting together different forces in nature, also in music, in the body, politic, or in the body as a medical image. But Harmonia, as a mythic character, was surrounded by violence. She was the daughter of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but not with Aphrodite's husband, with the god of war, Ares. So she is the product of sex and aggression. And here was this girl born to Aphrodite, goddess of love. And her real husband, who was the god's blacksmith, was jealous. So he gave Harmonia a wedding gift, which was a gold necklace he had made, which had a curse on it. So anybody who stole it or took it would be destroyed. So Harmonia exists on a knife edge. Just one element out of balance means discord or disease. And the philosopher Heraclitus pointed out that harmonia depends on tension. I play a stringed instrument, I play the viola, and I know that, what a lot of tension there is in a string, and you have to turn that peg and wood slips on wood or it sticks. It's very difficult, and you have to get it exactly in the right place, micrologically, microtonally, in order to get the absolute pitch. And that tension is what is behind harmonia. And as Heraclitus said, it is the bent back bow or the bent back strings of the lyre. There would be no harmony, he says, without high and low, without opposites, no animals without male and female. Well, the great image of music, of civilization, music as a unifying force which brings everything together, animals and all elements of society, of people, is music, and the personification of it is Orpheus. But Orpheus ends up with loss and failure. He fails to get his beloved back from the underground, and when he comes back to the land, to upper earth, he is torn to pieces by the Maenads, maddened women. There is the violence of that tension that holds everything together, and it snaps back if it's disturbed. Again, that fissure in our own divided nature. Like Shiva, we are both destructive and creative. Or as the Greeks put it, Zeus is lord of the dark sky and lord of the bright sky. Well, when we realized what we were doing to nature, and when we understood that nature was vulnerable to us, nature is so big. Here is Badra Wildlife Sanctuary, beautiful place. I've been there several times. I saw it when it was regenerating. It's so big that we forget. How could a tiger be vulnerable to us? How could a forest be vulnerable to me? There's this realization that nature was vulnerable to our own destructive, creative qualities. What did we try to do? Because we realized that it was also we were vulnerable along with it. We were part of it. And the rise of conservation, a quick sort of overview. The first national wildlife park was Yellowstone in America in 1872. People went on shooting wolves there because the vegetation changed, because it took a long time to realize that a healthy ecosystem needs all its elements, the predators as well as the prey. So when wolves were brought back in 1995, they began to keep in balance the vegetation from the overgrazing herds. In 1889, the American public started worrying about losing the bison. In 1903, Roosevelt created in Florida America's first national bird reserve, the beginning of the wildlife refuge system there. In London in 1895, a sewage cleanup brought back fish species to the Thames, which our wonderful Environment Agency is now reversing. In 1905, the word smog came in with concerns about polluted air. But it was in India in 1855 that the first large-scale forest conservation program happened in the world, with concern about the destructive effects of deforestation and the need for a scientific way of conserving forests. And I think it's not accident that two of the very articulate people about this were two doctors, Scottish doctors. In the 1840s, there was James Ranald Martin. I think he was in Calcutta. He was a military surgeon. His reports linked human and environmental health, showing the effects forests had on human well-being. Well, in Madras, another Scottish doctor, who was also a botanist, and I think that's not accident either, because it's the connection between plants as well as animals and human health and human well-being that is sort of so essential with a forest and with this sense of connectivity. There are so many parties to it. Image of the mycorrhizal network, you get who would have thought that it's the mushrooms or the fungi that are actually getting the trees underneath the ground to communicate with each other and help them all to feed. So this guy, Alexander Gibson, headed the Madras Board of Revenue and helped all the local people to set up conservation. And that became the first state management of forests in the world. So there were huge numbers of Indians, as well as underneath the ghastly Raj, who were at every local level promoting conservation, understanding that what the wilderness and what the forest needed. But what I want to talk about here is how this is linked with realizing things about ourselves. The rise, sorry, I've misspelled rise, of nature conservation extraordinarily coincides with discoveries about our own inner nature. Hormones. The Darwins first proved that something must be flowing in chemical messengers, as they were called, in plants to make them move and grow towards the light. And then in 1905, magic time of enormous scientific discoveries everywhere. These were discovered to exist in mammals too. Genes, again, 1905, William Bateson called the word genetics, working on these things in Cambridge, and gene came in 1909, genome 1920. And then it was realized that different genes related to different things in the environment. This is all about our own inner nature and our own connectivity with outer nature. Then this sort of genius, father of neuroanatomy, the Spanish neuroscientist Santiago Ramón y Cajal, discovered and drew what he called the arborization of brain cells and their networks. He called them, he said, like the entomologist, I chased in the gardens of grey matter cells with delicate and elegant forms, the mysterious butterflies of the soul, whose beating wings may one day reveal the secrets of the mind. And he was an artist. I mean, there have been art exhibitions of his extraordinary drawings and sort of studies of his work. And this is what they look like under the microscope. These dendrites, again, arborization, dendrites, all called from trees, we have within us a kind of mycorrhizal network, which is constantly renewing and going and moving, all these things moving and networking within us. All this was discovered around the time that we realized that we had to do something about nature and that people were trying to. It wasn't only in our bodies. Here was the unconscious. 1893, Freud coined the word subconscious, and then 1900 to 15 about the layers in the model of the psyche, which was absolutely connected to his great metaphorical love and huge physical love. I mean, he collected things. Troy was discovered in 1870, Minoan Crete, 1900 to 1995, and the great Indus civilization. People were noticing it, working on it, uncovering it, and this photograph was taken in 1920. So the depths of our past, the depths of our childhood also. It was around this time that people started writing stories, for proper writing for children, not just little animal moral tales, but actually imaginative writing. And so often they involved animals, wild animals. Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows, for example. At another also, this was the time when the great Ice Age paintings of Spain and France were discovered, showing that the beginnings of art, some of which even seemed to have perspective in them, were also connected with our representation, our attention to the wild animals whose earth we shared. And it's so interesting that at first they were rejected. They were of course fakes, because nobody that early could possibly have painted like that. And it was finally accepted. So I think this is a moment of valuing the connectedness, valuing the vulnerability and the services, as now fashionable to call it, of nature. Also valuing and understanding and respecting the complexities within us, within our own minds, psyches, and bodies, and the depths of our past, and how sophisticated. Nobody at first could believe that the ancient Indus cities were so sophisticated. So how do we deal with this when we know it's all changing now? We go to our divided human selves. Well, I haven't mentioned Plato, but that's there too. We are such divided creatures. And strangely, there is hostility. Strangely to me, but a lot of people, to a lot of people, it seems, quote, natural, whatever that word is, hostile to the very idea of protection. You couldn't get more vulnerable than a butterfly. And this is a picture of the Rio Grande that goes on the edge of a beautiful National Butterfly Center in Texas. But in 2019, Trump wanted to build a wall through it. And the Butterfly Center opposed it. So they built on the outside. Here's a nice picture of it. You can just see a little bit of green bush remaining in the center. And so the opposition began to accuse them of mad things. Here is a faked up image of the dock on the Butterfly Center shared online in 2019, noting an inflatable raft used by sex traffickers. And then the accusations of sex trafficking, which of course the Butterfly Center was a cover for, turned into child rape. This is weaponizing the idea of protection, because we are creatures in our divided natures that want to protect the vulnerable. But the toxic form of accusing them of child rape, here is the protest, the MAGA protest, just last month. There's finally closed this poor Butterfly Center. You can see the arms. There have been death threats. An amazing altercation I heard on YouTube about a woman sort of saying, I want to see where you do the child rape. I mean, just madness. And also an irony, because on the other side of the Rio Grande. It's the Mexican Butterfly Center. Here's the delightful director, Romero Gomez Gonzalez. He's saying, I invite you all to come and see this beautiful place. Well, Mexico has its own problems. It doesn't have Trump, but it does have avocado is the most lucrative crop. And the logging, he opposed the logging, illegal logging. And he was found dead face down in a ditch 2 years ago. And quite soon afterwards, a tour guide who also opposed the illegal loggers was found dead. Like environmentalists the world over, they are attacked by people fighting for vested interests. So what do we do? The scale of India, as I said, nature in India is so vast. And I've been very privileged in the last 22 years to meet a tiny fraction of the really wonderful conservation bodies that are working to answer that question, what can we do? For example, there are NGOs in Karnataka who have set up very expensive, it's hard to fund them, technology to alert people to when a herd of elephants is passing through, so villagers and farmers don't get hurt, and so that they can ward them off their crops. Or another one in Karnataka, that instant response gets compensation, help for compensation to villagers who may have been killed or their children or husbands killed, or who their crops being raided by elephants or boar, or help with the very complex forms for compensation, which is a way of sheltering both the wildlife and the human communities who live alongside them. And those are wonderful things. But this is an art conference, and maybe this is a little contentious, but I just wanted to alert you to a sort of new art form that seems to me to have come up on Instagram. I'm currently trying to write a book about elephants, but of course during COVID I couldn't go and see any elephants. But a lot of young conservationists are using Instagram as a way of showing people what is the wild and how to live with the wild. And I think they're wonderful. There are people, for instance, around the Corbett Reserve who are doing this with elephants. And this is a young man, Surya, who I first met 20 years ago when I was researching snakes, and I was going through Mysore. And there was an auto rickshaw driver called Snake Shyam who had started rescuing snakes from different places, all sorts of different places. And he took them in little boxes. He put them in his yard. I went to his home and saw all these snakes in the yard, and he showed me them. And Surya was a boy then, but he is now following in his father's footsteps, and he's rescuing snakes, which would otherwise be beaten to death and probably bite people in the process. And he's also using his Instagram platform, and he has lots of to educate. So here's an early version of it. And here are the people. They are running a little Xerox shop. They ran away quite properly from what they found. You see the problem.
Soft-scale viper right over here in this is an extremely rare snake and also one of the big four venomous snakes of India, which is responsible for most number of deaths. If in case the snake bites your gums, your tongue, it will start bleeding from the pores, and it's deadly venomous.
So he seems to have perfected a way of bags, but now this is a neater way of doing it, I can see. It's a very, very venomous one, so he uses a hook, and he just pops it into a jar, and a perforated lid. And here he is, and I want to concentrate on this as a kind of performative little art form, which also educates and helps and protects both wildlife and why didn't that work? Wildlife and people. So this is a garage at night. He's called out all the time. Where's the snake? Where's the snake?
Okay, so we have warmth in these cold temperatures. So I request all of you to just check your vehicle for taking it out, because there might be
explaining why it's there,
resting
what it needs. So, he warns them about accidents in his Instagram posts. And you know, if it stays there, it might cause you an accident if it gets going when you're driving. So he shows it. That's part of the performance. These have a sort of delicate balance. He shows it around. Playing in Canada. Explains what you have to do. Check your vehicle. And on World Snake Day, he doesn't post something like this, which explains the need for snakes in the environment.
Here to talk about the importance of snakes in the cities. Snakes are benefiting us directly or indirectly in a lot of ways. And if each and every snake is taken out of the city and released in the jungle, there will be an imbalance in the ecosystem. The snakes released in the forests will start consuming every bird, squirrel, and other seed dispersing animals that will reduce the rate of plant population. There will be territorial fights with existing population and may cannibalize if there is a lack of prey density. On the other hand, there will be a rise in rodent population, which are disease and infection carriers, which will affect our health later on. And also, rodents destroy a lot of livestock and crops which the farmers grow. Drinking water samples are already tested with rodent fecal matter, and that's why we have to conserve snakes for our survival. Thank you.
So I think that's a really interesting use of a kind of art form. Each has a structure. He goes to a place. It may be a factory, it may be a prison, it may be a domestic home where there is a snake people are scared of. And you know, a lot of them, like the saw-scale viper or the cobras, he seems to have masses of cobras on his Instagram. And he educates, he explains, gets them to understand, recognize, and educate. And so I think that is a really interesting use of that technology to make a kind of art which people can identify and follow. But what runs through this whole thing is our own divided nature. And like Darwin's vision of nature, it's a tangle. We are a tangle. And the harmonia, in Greek terms, of the human soul is a constant struggle. And in a lot of politics worldwide, especially at the moment, what often wins this struggle is the greedy and destructive. But there are also good forces. There are the wonderful NGOs supported by lots and lots of people working very hard with very little money for something they passionately love and value. And they need all our support. And I think this is where art comes in. Art can really help conservation. That little green umbrella protecting the vulnerable from the coming wave. So I'd just like to end up by thanking you and thanking you for this conference, but also pointing out that the state of nature depends on the state of human nature. And as this elephant hiding knows in each country, well, it doesn't know that, of course it doesn't, but we can imagine that it might, because in each country, the state of nature depends on the nature of the state. Thank you.
Are we on? Is this working? Okay. Ruth, thank you so much for a marvelous and inspiring presentation which also, I think, reminds us of a number of the questions, the divisions that we've been reflecting on in the course of yesterday, and this will continue as we go along. It just struck me that to a profound extent, you're also thinking about the division between languages in a certain way. On the one hand, there is the language of policy, of control, of institutionality, which has its basis in an enlightenment project that is singularly lacking in self-doubt. Including, when you showed us the stripping of trees in Somerset along the riverbanks, it seems like a small local detail, but it really speaks to this lack of self-doubt. It reminds me also of the mad schemes of compensatory afforestation that we have in India, where you think that if you destroy, the state thinks that if, a large swath of trees is cut down in one place, you'll make up for it by just planting another bunch of trees somewhere else, and all is well, and the balance of nature is served. So there is that. On the other hand, you're drawing on the language of myth, on etymology, on asking us to reflect with a deeper sense of mutuality. And this to me is really a question, because the language of policy, the language of power is so persuasive. How does one continuously critique it? How does one present the opposite, as you've done today? This seems to me to be a question. How do we, in some way, spread the word that there's another way of looking? So this is something I'd probably put in play as a first sort of question to you. Also, in terms of the work you yourself are involved with as a conservationist in building a community of resistance. And is there a possibility of dialogue, really? Because in the end, the power to transform landscapes and to legislate on multi-species relationships to a great extent resides with the state, with state agencies and with corporations. So what is the ground of dialogue? Is it possible to seek some kind of common ground? It's a huge open question, but how does one approach it?
Yes, in the charity which I'm a trustee of, we have had politicians in the past. But of course, most politicians do not want to dialogue with conservationists. And that's part of the problem. I think one element in this is the way that official dialogue often goes towards the abstract. And conservationists on the ground, like the young man who was rescuing snakes, they have to deal with the very physical details, the grainy details of the concrete. And poetry can deal with the relation of the abstract and the concrete, but I'm not sure that government can. The language of the Environment Agency in defending its raid on the banks said, measures are in place. What does that mean? Measures are in place. Measures are in place. And then the whistle jerk thing, the dog whistle thing of it'll be planted with native trees. The trees were already there. They were already native. And I'd like to sort of go on to, part of what we have here at the moment is a lot of dog whistle, what people talk about dog whistle politics. So the dog whistle in the case of the Butterfly Center is, child rape. Immediately you get child rape, you get, oh, it's a bad place, we must, we must use our arms against it. I mean, imagine taking a whole lot of huge guns to surround a butterfly center. It's sort of, that's the language. I mean, the language of the state is often backed up by those things. So I don't know. I mean, I hope there will be people in your conference who talk about community politics, because in the end, it always comes down to communities and the local. And one of the people whom I sat at the feet of when I started my tiger research was the great field zoologist George Schaller, who said the problems of nature conservancy are always universal. And those were the problems outlined in that slide about the sixth extinction. But the solutions are always local. And I mean, I remember when I was once giving a talk about tigers in the Highlands of Scotland. And they were very interested in the tigers, but in questions, within 1 minute, we were talking about badgers and chickens, because tigers are all very well, but the badgers eat their chickens. It's their badgers that they are concerned with. And that's what every state has to negotiate, is how you deal with the local concerns of the local communities versus the bigger problems. And how can language do that? I don't know, Ranjit.
I know. We have a question from Amitangshu Acharya. Is there a mic that can travel to Amitangshu, or you could come up here?
Ruth, thank you for such an amazing presentation that was so evocative. I love the way you ended it. The state of nature depends on the nature of the state. Very telling lines. I just wanted to ask you, how do you align the concern here that when you look at a snake, the immediate reaction is to attack it or to save ourselves, and at the same time a snake is sacred. In large parts of the country, it's worshipped. Sometimes worshipped to the point of their, endangering the animal itself. How does that align? How is it that our conservation action doesn't seem to kind of, this weird paradox that we see? I just wanted your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, well, I thought a lot about that when I was doing the research for my snake novel. Well, we are divided creatures, and the sacred is dangerous. That's why, going back to the Greek example, you need the sacred, but it's also can endanger you. And the elephant is sacred too, but people kill it, and because it eats their paddy. I think that's why the mediation of art and this little art form, the Instagram thing, is so powerful. He's got something like 20,000 followers on Instagram. He is showing them, he says things like, "Don't pick this Russell viper up yourself," or the cobra. But he's showing them that he conserves it, and he's showing them that the snake is valuable in our environment as well as being sacred. I think sacred is a really powerful tool for conservation, and I wish we had more of it in Britain.
But not only in Britain, but also here, Ruth, I think part of our problem is the erosion of the customary understanding, or what's been traditional. I know that temenos is a central aspect of your thinking, the sanctuary, the sacred grove that can only be violated on pain of retribution. You talked about this as well. And this is the kind of sacred logic that has saved ecosystems, but it's all completely under erosion, not only the landscape itself, but also, as speakers yesterday have addressed this issue and will do so today. How do we bridge that? The landscape, its customary, traditional understanding, the way in which the relationship between humankind and nature has been regulated. It's interesting that today we bridge that through Instagram and this truly interesting work that you showed of Surya Kirti's. But it seems like that is much more an activist, didactic tonality. It's not as if we can really rely on these earlier myths. And that seems to be a truly tragic erosion of consciousness and sensibility. But could you talk about this in the context of your work with both the tiger and the elephant?
Yes, it's of course a very complex thing to talk about communities and sensibilities in a country that is not your own. And I know what it is like here, so in Asia, I mean, I saw it in Bhutan, for instance. There are tigers in Bhutan. They live very high up. And I talked to quite a lot of people there, and Bhutan is doing very well in its conservation. It has this. It's a small country. It can afford to talk about gross national happiness as well as whatever else material things. But I did hear that this enormous reverence which the Buddhism keeps the tiger in, one of the 4 sacred animals in Bhutanese Buddhism, to guard the sacred. They still have poachers, they still have tiger killing and so on. And I realized that then that tigers actually pass through all 3 images of the 3 great world religions, Hinduism and Islam in Sumatra and the cross in Russia. And in all of them, religion does not save. When we just have to go back to Plato's image, really, of the divided soul. There are base elements in all of us, and profit sometimes wins out. And I do not know how, whether the theologians or anything else, how you can protect against that.
Is there another question? Rahul, do you have a question? Oh, you can come up here if there's... Rahul Ranjan has a question for you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Is it working, the mic? Oh, come up here.
It does not. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you so much for the fantastic talk. So my question is, so if climate change, which sort of act as a background to your presentation, and that's leading to extinction and biodiversity crisis. But if we were to approach climate change also as a crisis of imagination, that's leading to a loss of language in which we can speak of what's unfolding. How would you approach the crisis of imagination within climate change?
Well, I'm a writer, and you can only do it by writing narratives in which people identify with things, I suppose. I was thinking there's a little children's opera by Benjamin Britten called Noah's Flood, about the flood of Noah. And there's a moment he's built the boat, and he and his sons, and they're getting all the animals onto it. And there's his wife, Mrs. Noah. And she doesn't want to get on some beastly boat, and she wants to go on drinking with what she calls her gossips, her friends. And I have my gossips, I don't want to go on your boat. And they have to drag her on, and the music gets wilder and more powerful, like the waves coming up as they gradually drag her on. And actually, it's an awful scene because you know that everybody else is going to die. And somebody pointed out to me that Michelangelo's vision of the flood in the Sistine Chapel is probably the first image of refugees, of everybody running away from Goya's giant, from the thing. And it's the imagination. I don't know, I mean, the film Don't Look Up, I don't know if anybody has seen the film Don't Look Up. That was a sort of imaginative way of understanding what a disaster that is threatening the world can do. But, we are such short-termists, and I don't know how we can address this, but I think your point is absolutely right. It needs to be about imagination.
And Ruth, we have a question from one of our online listeners, I'm going to say. I seem to have become transported into the era of radio here, but and the question goes like this. Italo Calvino has argued that unlike the weight of data that rationality imposes, the poet's refusal to look at the word directly, but indirectly through metaphor, affords lightness. Should revolution depend on poetics rather than rational argument?
Maybe we can see poetry as mediating between the rational and the affective in a way. We have these sort of, there's a sort of image of the rider and the elephant, and the rider is the rationality and deciding on the path, but the elephant, of course, is much more powerful and decides what it wants to eat and so on. And and of course the elephant has its own ways of working. And maybe poetics is kind of between the rider and the elephant. And it's that sort of way of understanding both the head and the heart. And I hope that any revolution, if it comes, will be able to do that.
I think this is a crisis that many writers face today across societies, which is what is the claim you make to public reason? What is your place in the public sphere, in debate? How have you, this is again a biographical question, Ruth, how have you managed this question across the different genres in which you practice and your various commitments to the public sphere? Is there a sense that you feel you need to be something other than a poet in order to intervene, or do you feel there's still a voice for, a place for the voice of the poet, as someone who can speak truth to a society in disarray?
I think there is, and a lot of the poetry collections that have recently won a lot of public attention here in Britain are things about public crises. For instance, with the Grenfell Tower, the burning of a tower where a lot of people died, of a public housing tower, or racial violence. Those are the things grounded in individual stories, and we have to go back to the age-old thing that it's the individual story, and that's why I think the Instagram is such an interesting thing, because it's an individual and people can identify the individual and with the individual. I just wanted to say that going back to the rider and the elephant, the head and the heart, that's politically as well as poetically what's winning out all the time is identity and self-interest and the appeal to reason. We knew so many things about the person who's currently running the UK government. Everybody knew things about that person that are now being shown to be true, but they voted anyway. They voted for him anyway. So rationality is not enough.
Ruth, we also have a question which turns the focus the other way to the logic of the sacred. This is from Latika, who's joining us online. And her question is as follows. As we see every day in India with the cow, the logic of the sacred is used to justify extreme violence and repression of pluralist food practices and much else. How does one reconcile to these ideas of the sacred?
Yes, I think it's not only in India. I think in Islam as well, and of course, as has happened throughout the centuries in Christianity, one particularly narrow, slightly perverted image of the sacred is being used in what is really culture wars and identity wars. So that's the trouble. I mean, every good thing can be warped and toxified, and that's why that's why harmonia is such a difficult balance, and why it needs tension, constant tension all the time, just as a lyre needs to be kept in tune all the time. I mean, in America, the fundamental Christians there are just a mirror image of the very Saudified sort of version of Islam that they think they're fighting, that they're. So the war on terror was a sort of mirror image of the war within America, really.
Thank you so much for these responses, Ruth. And as we come to the end of this session, I want to hold in mind a number of the themes and the images that you've shared, but particularly this one. The idea that we constantly need to tune the lyre and to remain focused on the tension between harmony and discord as we create new mandates for ourselves as responsible, participatory citizens, if you will, and how we bring also our own disciplines and our domains to bear on the larger public sphere. And I also thought we should, you spoke of Orpheus and how when he rises back from the underworld, he's torn apart by the Maenads. I thought maybe we could close with the image of what happens to his head when they throw it into the river, but he continues to sing. The head that's been lopped off its body still continues to sing as it goes down the river. Yeah. And I think maybe that's a token of hope for song, for poetry, for articulation, and for resistance.
That's wonderful, yes.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It's been a marvelous way to begin this day of reflections, to really have you guide us into the labyrinth of myth and to show us how incredibly relevant these archetypal templates still are and how we can reanimate them for our present purposes. Thank you so much for your generosity as always, Ruth, and for being with us this afternoon, your morning.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.